Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I am your host, author Matthew Hines. Today we have an amazing guest. We have Dr. Nick Begich from Alaska. He's standing by right now, but before we get started, let's take care of some business. We need to thank a few of our subscribers and commenters like White Wave, King Tor, Judith Caldwell, and I cannot forget Sita Rainbow. Thank you all for subscribing and leaving comments in the comments section. Now, if you are new to the podcast, then this is a podcast where authors are allowed to come on, talk about their books, talk about their motivations for writing and the writing experience. This is a podcast to bring authors and readers together. So it's with great pleasure that we bring somebody like Dr. Nick Begich, who is a famous activist, onto the podcast. Now, I would just like to remind people, you don't hear commercials on here. We don't monetize on YouTube. We get our donations from you through patreon.com, through the purchase of our authors' books from affiliate links at the end of this video on YouTube, or from Books in Hindsight or hindsight.com, where those affiliate links and the author information is presented. So that's how we keep going. If you want to keep us going, go ahead and buy one of Dr. Nick Begich's books, or consider a sponsorship on Patreon at patreon.com/hindsight. All right, then. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this podcast. Now, without further ado, let's bring him out. Let's bring out Dr. Nick Begich. Let's go to the phone.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Hines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. As I promised you, I have Dr. Nick Begich from Alaska. He is with us today to talk about his books, specifically his latest book, Controlling the Mind. But I became associated with Dr. Begich, or I should say Dr. Nick Begich, because he originally wrote a book called Angels Don't Call This HAARP, I believe that was. I read that in the 90s. I was so fascinated by it, and I just didn't know what the motivation was for a person who would write this. And because it really goes into a lot of a secret government and a weapons program that nobody really knows about, and nobody even knows the potential of it. But today we're going to go even farther beyond that, because Dr. Begich doesn't sit still very often, and he is really into talking about the dangers of technology. So without further ado, Dr. Nick Begich, welcome to Books in Hindsight.
Hey, thanks for having me. You know, the first book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, that you mentioned, and was kind of the beginning of all of this, you know, for me at least in terms of public writing. You know, and I was in my 30s back then, you know, and so I was not really thinking I was going to be doing writing professionally at all. In fact, it was something I knew I might eventually do, but wasn't really on the drawing board. But I'd written an article about HAARP that had gotten a little bit of notoriety, and as a consequence, became acquainted with Jean Manning, who was a journalist for over 30 years and had actually published her first book on new energy. It was The Coming Energy Revolution was her title. But we got together in Seattle, actually right where you are, and at the airport there, had a conversation when I was flying over to Finland in 1994. And in the course of that conversation, we decided we'd collaborate on a book, and that, of course, became Angels Don't Play This HAARP. But my interest in that whole area of science and technology, without kind of reviewing it, was the idea that electromagnetic fields could affect the human body. And so my interest was really more about sort of what could you do, with energy. It's sort of the root of health sciences, in my view, is biophysics, which deal with the energy exchanges below the chemical reactions that are, what most scientists and most medical professionals deal with is chemical reactions in body tissue. But the biophysics, that's what drives it. That's what got me interested in the HAARP project. So it was basically energy technology. But underlying that, in the book we're talking about today, Controlling the Human Mind, now this was sort of the deeper side of it. Could you override brain function with, external means? So that became exciting. And then the book, Controlling the Human Mind, sort of the main focus. And really my primary focus going into all of this to begin with was what could we do to enhance human performance? And in the course of that, what are the sort of the safeguards too? Because opening the mind and consciousness, is kind of the root to who we are, right?
Okay, so just to give you, our listeners and our viewers on YouTube, a little background. Nick has a very famous, noteworthy Alaska family that I'm going to let him talk about a little bit if he chooses to, but we need to talk about, so you didn't just decide to start talking about one of the military's and science's most secret projects based on Tesla technology. This actually is something that kind of goes against the grain. So did you somehow become a rebel in your early teens? Is that what spawned this?
I've always, I come from a political family, 3 generations of my family dealing with local, state, national, international politics. And so, you come at things a little bit differently. And in Alaska, we're really a big state, as you know, you yourself having lived here for a short time. But as a big state, we have a very small population. Most of it's concentrated in a few urban areas, primarily Anchorage. Half the state lives in Anchorage or the Anchorage area. And so when things are going on here, you generally know about it. There's only about 1,000 people that actually influence policy in my state. Beyond the average voter's, participation. But people who get involved and engaged, there's about 1,000 in Alaska. So something's going on, you kind of know about it. At least that's been my experience. But in this, in some of these projects, like that one in particular, it came out of a really short article I read in an Australian publication that just seemed too outlandish, quite frankly. And I went to the library here in Anchorage. Lusac Library is a federal repository where any federal record that's public, they have to get it for you. So I went, checked the sources, and found a bunch more. And then I went around to some of the organizations I thought might be paying attention to this that weren't. But they had some files based on the surface disturbance. The Audubon Society had some things because they're going to disrupt some land surface, rebuild this thing. But that really got me to dig much deeper, and then within a couple days, because it's my nature anyway, I find enough to say, hey, people should be looking at this a little differently. And then I had a background in an interest in sciences, particularly the area of electrophysiology, the effect of electromagnetic fields on the body, so they kind of overlap. Family-wise, my dad was a state senator, U.S. Congressman. My brother was a U.S. Senator. My mom was involved in Democratic politics. I was on the board for the Alaska Independent Party for a number of years, and I'm registered as actually a libertarian these days. But I think I left the Democrats about 35 years ago, quite a long time ago. But I think when they left me, actually, is when I could be a Democrat. But the point is, these technologies weren't being discussed either in my region or elsewhere, so that led to the writing of that book. But the other aspect of this technology was sort of the side effects of the effects on human beings, and again, getting into the issue of the mind and consciousness and the things that you can do with external fields. That was a big concern, but the overlap really was there. And I come from classical organizing background, so the way I approached this was way different. My view was to function more as an investigative reporter, stripping away the layers of the onion and really documenting what I was seeing, so that an average person could look at it, and if they didn't have technical knowledge, by the time they got done reading it, if you have a high school education, you figure it out enough of it to get it, and if you want to dig deeper, enough footnotes to go there. If you're a PhD and want to go dig around. So
well, I figured it out. So you were successful. So, all right. Now, you found this project, like I said, that was basically inspired by Tesla, and you point that out in the book. And it would be my concern if I were writing that nobody's going to publish this. First of all, because it's a top secret project, right? But you went ahead and did it, correct?
Right. And actually, I self-published, created a publishing company, actually, when I started, and that was the first book out. But it's been, sold to 10 other language translations around the world with other publishers and is out there. And it ended up, science and technology book, all of the publishers and mainstream publishers say, it'll never sell, it'll never do anything, and people won't read it. Well, it sold over 100,000 copies. That's quite a few in anybody's book world these days. The average book only sells about 7,000, so I think we did okay with something technical. But more importantly, we did 4,000 radio broadcasts over 25 years on this technology and related technology. So that's a lot of penetration in getting an idea out, which is the whole reason I wrote the book to begin with, was it needed to be debated, and the issues around it need to be debated, and it has been, along with a lot of other things that we've been able to disclose over the years, following that same venue. Work with public documents, put the story together, and let the public decide how they want to interpret it and what they want to do with it.
Okay, great. And I'm going to just stop for a second here. I just want to give people a little bit more of your professional background, political background. You are the head of the Anchorage Federation of Teachers. Is that correct?
I was head of Anchorage Council of Education, and the Alaska Federation of Teachers,
and you were elected
statewide, right? And I did, I think, 4 terms actually between them all, because when I was in the Anchorage Council of Education, we were an independent organization, and I was elected president. I was 26 years old, and I organized them into actually a professional union. We affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers and the Alaska Federation of Teachers, and I was elected subsequently Vice President of Political Affairs for a number of years, and then on to the presidency of both organizations. And I stayed president of ACE, Anchorage Council of Education, pretty much all the years I worked for the school system, and I had about a 10-year career in that type of work. In those days, we were organizing the university. We organized university professors statewide, organized all the supervisors and state government under us. We merged our unions, and that's when I quit doing the work. I had a little different view of the world, and it was around that time that I started doing this work, actually. 94 is when I was sort of leaving the district and moving more into research and writing, which had been sort of my sideline, my whole life, was science. That's where I really started, and where my interests were. Public service was sort of the overlap. And so this has been the last 25 years, kind of that combination. I've been able to use my voice with an understanding of how to get information out and document it properly. And so the combination has been kind of unique, but I think helpful in the public discourse, because in this century, this century we're in now, what makes governments powerful, what makes them strong, is their technology. So when you think about that as a population that is, supposedly we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that means we have to decide sort of the direction of our technologies. So we have to know enough about them. We don't have to know how to build them. We don't have to know the engineering behind them. Maybe those are legitimately national secrets. But what they do, we ought to be discussing. Whether it's a blinding laser or something to override mental function, something to manipulate weather or create an earthquake, because these are the technologies of the 21st century that I'm not just talking about, that are documented in military literature, hundreds of documents that we've used to support what's happening, from Secretary's Defense quotes to Secretary of Energy, Department of the Navy, the Air Force, all of them. And sort of what it distills down to is we are already past midnight on a lot of this. And we've been out there talking about technologies now 25 years. what you see in the mainstream today about privacy and how that all works, we reported on this 20 years ago, and documented it. So we are past midnight on some of it. We need to grab it back and reel it back in, because a lot of things that have happened have gotten out of control.
Okay,
and
so
it is about control.
Sorry. Okay, so Nick, you talked to you've talked at The Hague. Is that correct?
It was the European Parliament,
okay,
and we were brought in on their. Actually, we did a bunch of presentations in Europe on a couple things, on HAARP for sure, on non-lethal weapons technologies, things that don't kill you but can really maim you in certain ways, and then on the mind effects technology, how to override mental function, or what the military in the Directorate of Electromagnetic Director of the Air Force refers to as controlled effects, what they call controlled effects, and they cover 3 separate areas. They cover hardware, equipment, how to overrun the electronics on equipment so that you can burn out diodes and things, cause things to malfunction. A secondary, sort of lower energy density, a little differently directed, is to affect the computers, the software, by creating bit errors, by being able to send surges, pulses of energy, disrupt the flow of, the flow of electrons. And then the third level is to interfere with the 5 basic senses of the human body. And this is smell, taste, touch, to be able to create complete memory sets or illusions. This was actually written about in a document called Technology Horizons in 2002. And that's a U.S. Air Force document as an example. These are the kind of documents cited in Controlling the Human Mind as we get into each of these technologies and look at them. The same with Angels Don't Play This HAARP. Both books are based on a corpus of documents that it's not speculation. And this is the big thing, and often people look at the material in terms of the subject matter and say, oh, conspiratorial, stuff. But if you stop long enough to read the footnotes, and we put them on each page, so you read the page and you look at the bottom, and you can decide, and you can immediately look them up, and decide whether we've quoted correctly or what have you. And I think this is really important, especially on an issue like this, because when you think about it in the modern context, which is the modern context of social media, Googles, and big data, what we warned about, what we told about, is even more striking.
Yes. And we're definitely going to talk about that, but I need to ask you a little bit about the process, because we go from the HAARP, and then we get into am I looking at the right page here? No, I'm not. Earth Rising. You have 2 books called Earth Rising. So in HAARP, we have basically the installation out in Alaska, right, where you talk about what it does. But when you're investigating this stuff, at the same time you're investigating it, the technology is improving. So are you finding? Is that what's happening? So you're just finding more stuff. So can you talk a little bit about? I guess the next book was Earth Rising, or was it? Right. It was actually, there was a book. There was Towards a New Alchemy was the second one, and we pulled that off the market. The Earth Rising, the Revolution was the next one. Earth Rising 2, and then Controlling the Human Mind was the last book. And when you look at the evolution of all this, what we were doing at that time as an organization is we were collecting data all the time. We went through over 100,000 documents and reduced it to 20,000 that at that time we had in our library. And those were being indexed. So I think we indexed up to 8,000 of those. So you'll see in the bottom of our books an EPI number, it'll be EPI and then a number. And that was the original file number that article went in. So we could pull it if we ever were interviewed by press. We never found it. We said, well, here it is, And that's the way we did that. We set up our indexing system and integrated it into our footnotes, and then we had it in a big database and available for a while. We had it through the Lay Institute on Technology, which was a nonprofit founded by the Lay PepsiCo family, and I was their ED, their executive director, and we did some things together to try and get this information out there. And really, that's what it was about. We were an information organization. We also published 9 micro books, which were 64 pages each and were topically oriented
to things in sciences and technology I thought people need to know about, or politics. There was a lot of mixed overlay between politics, economics, technology, because what we saw emerging was this technocracy, which we see today, functioning all around us. And so we came at it at every sort of direction that the data took us, is really where it was. And then because the way we approached the writing was way different. When I wrote Earthrising 2, what I did is all those indexed articles then that I had read and highlighted the parts that we wanted to quote or reference, that was then typed into a machine. So then I had the footnote in and I had the quote in. And then I organized all those based on topic. And then within those topics, organized them chronologically or organized them just in the way they logically flowed. And those became chapters. And then I organized the chapters in an appropriate order. And then I wrote transition sections on the beginning of each chapter and the end of each chapter, make it work like a book. Then I wrote a front end and a back end, and there you have it. There was the book. But it was driven by the research, telling us how to create the outcome. And then the same thing happened with Earthrising 2, but it was in 4 separate fields, because by then you could see 4 subdivisions: cell phones, underwater sonars, HAARP updates, and then personal privacy. So it became the themes where the data took us, and that's always where we went. Now, when the last book came, that's where the data began for me, was consciousness and mind studies. And that's where I took the data, because that's when I said, you know what, out of all this stuff, there's one issue that matters, and that's what happens between our ears, individually and collectively. That became the issue worth pursuing, and that's why I really haven't written a lot for publication since then, because that has been the theme. Took a little bit of intermission, I think, for about 5 years, and I have something that I may publish later this year, but totally different from anything I've done before.
Okay, so going back to Earthrising, you, unlike most people who bring out a gloom and doom scenario, you actually, in Earthrising, I kind of get the feeling that you are presenting a more positive, if we do it this way, it could turn out well. Whereas most people just want to scare the what out of you.
Right.
But you actually, in a lot of your writing, you say, well, no, that this is a way that we can use this to our own good, which is something that we don't see that much. So could you I'd just like to know for myself, if somebody's listening, what kind of examples of technology are they going to see in Earthrising? You talked about cell phone technology. What does that have to do with our psyche?
Well, we talked about a lot of things. I mean, sort of the sub-themes are in terms of who we are. Think about how data is used today. And this stuff we warned about in Earthrising Revolutions. How would big data be used to manipulate us? And what we said back then is that they will be able to profile you so well that they'll be able to send you messaging just directly tailored to you. So like the politician emerges, and Donald Trump uses, and Brexit uses. That's why he defied all of the polls. Okay? He used the technology we predicted 20 years ago, and it worked. Worked for Brexit too. And what you do is you take all that data in, you get a profile on the individual. The individual. This is what Google does. This is what Facebook does. This is what all of these systems do. This is what our government does on steroids, because it's the ultimate aggregator of all data. And some people believe quantum computing already exists, where you can sort this data and get some profile. Let me tell you, we talk about that if we have time, but the point of all this is what it allows you to do is predict with such accuracy. It's like a cycle. So the pop-up ads come up. Hey, I was just thinking about watching that movie. This kind of stuff, where it's just eerie, creepy eerie. Okay, now how does that work? 3,000 data inputs, 3,000 data collection points. We talked about this, called a data valence when I wrote about it. This stuff all made it into the European Parliament. The reason they have stricter, more stringent review of all these privacy issues started with us. I can say that clearly. You look at the Science and Technology Directorate in the European Parliament's research from this period of time, and you will see my work quoted widely because it was cited widely. We predicted the abandonment of the ABM Treaty in front of the European Parliament 20 weeks before. Senator Stevens went on the Senate floor and said there is no Soviet Union, therefore there is no treaty, which is exactly the rationale we said the U.S. would apply. something that every security agency in Europe didn't buy, and the only point the European Parliament Subcommittee on Disarmament even argued with me about in my presentation. And 10 months later, 2 months before our resolution passed the European Parliament, they got the rude awakening when William Jefferson Clinton abandoned that treaty as President of the United States and did it unilaterally. Now, why is all this important? Because we got all our data from the open public literature to take us to those kinds of conclusions. We take you there, the reader, and we come to a conclusion. And we do editorialize, I'll acknowledge that. We give you all those facts, all those footnotes, and we come to a conclusion. Not neutered, neutral news that pretends to be. We tell you what we think and we give a set of solutions. And we do that in everything we write, because bitching about the problem is the root of the problem. It's creating a debate over solutions, which is what we should be doing. And this is where the beginning of the change takes place.
And that is also why you should be in politics. All right. So we just need to stop for a second here, because you are just jumping over things that we really need to talk about. So what we're talking about right now is, and I guess we're just going to kind of go into controlling the human mind, although this is probably in Earth Rising as well, as we just need to jump into the brain as a machine. Right. So can you tell us a little bit about how the brain works? So when you start telling us about how it's being manipulated, we understand how the brain works, first of all. Right.
Okay. When you think about the human brain, generally speaking, in terms of what you can do with this, you've got energy moving around. You've got the basic stuff. Left brain is your constructive, sort of mathematical, lay it out brain, your structured brain. Your right brain is your more liberal, creative side, actually. And this is the side where all those really wild ideas come from, that the left brain says, oh no, turn that one off, turn that one off. The key is working with them both, all right? And what they have found is that as we gain in age, from early on, we have more of a balanced hemisphere. So the structured sort of the brain and the creative side of the brain, they're talking to each other all the time. They're working with each other all the time, evolving solutions all the time. That's why little children learn so fast and integrate all of this knowledge, social knowledge, language skills, all this stuff like sponges up until around the time we get them in school, right? And then we start emphasizing with little girls certain things, little boys certain things. Now we kind of do the gender neutral thing, so we kind of screw them up equally. What happens is they dominate one side of the brain or the other, and this is what begins to form up, and you begin to see it. So what they discovered is that certain things could bring this back into balance. In fact, bring it into balance in a way that very, very few people can. And there was a technology patented by Monroe back in the I believe it was in even the 1970s when these patents were initially issued. But you can see them in the book, Controlling the Human Mind, as an example. And what it does is sound signals coming in to each ear. Now, we don't hear in the low frequency ranges. And here's how the brain, predominant brainwave activity in deep sleep, it's delta, 1 to 4 pulses or vibrations per second. The next stage is theta, which is about 4 to 7 hertz or pulses or vibrations per second. This is where 3 to 5-year-olds spend a lot of their time. This is where you are between awake and asleep, when you're in that twilight state where you're watching your dream happen, but you're still kind of awake. That's where these little guys are, which kind of explains they're sort of playing with imagination and reality, and they get kind of lost in it, and we get confused by that. Well, that's where they are, you see, as they're awake, but they're walking around in this light theta, low alpha range. And the alpha range is in that focus zone where intellectually and creatively you're there. You're the basketball player in the zone. You're the artist in the zone. You're the speaker in the zones when you're there. And then you start getting above that, agitated states. Now, what they learned is that in the case of binaural beat, you can't hear those low frequencies down that low. But what you can do is send a signal in, say, at 15,000 hertz, which is in the range of human hearing. And then in the other ear, 15,007 hertz. And then you cancel out in the middle and you get the difference, which in this case would be 7 hertz. 15,000 off of 15,007. And that's the beat frequency. And then both hemispheres begin to beat to that. Boop, 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 boop. You drop into a theta state, on the border of alpha, in kind of that space. So for relaxation, you can drive there, or you can drive to some other frequency for focused attention, memory work, meditation, relaxation, or invigoration. So you can drive with sound. You can drive with flickering light the same way. The optic nerve will pick this up. And the brain, both hemispheres will begin, one, because there's a crossover in the eyes, so it'll catch the other hemisphere of the brain as they come in. So again, you can do it with electrocranial stimulation, the stimulation on the cranium of the head, boop, 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 with DC energy, or you can do it through the electric grid, through a flicker rate on a television screen coming through the internet, a modulation on your cell phone. Any electromagnetic carrier in the world can carry a modulation that has an impact on mental function.
Okay, so that is, and so this is something that, and I have to just throw this in right now, that you're not screaming all of this. I'm shocked that, first of all, because you've told us that they can, through the manipulation of what we see on social media, they can basically predict what our behavior, they can control our behavior to a fairly, they're pretty confident in their ability to do that. And then you're telling us that there is a technology using sound that can basically alter our mood. And they do it, and it can be done to children.
That's pretty easy.
Is it? But okay, so let's go back to the government. And let's go back to, we talked about this before we started this, about how education started in like the 20s or the teens, and they're bringing in these immigrants and they want to make everybody into Americans. So they use like B.F. Skinner technology, right? They use classical conditioning.
Same idea.
Yeah. But they're using it with radio waves.
Bernays and some of the other guys, early guys. And even Estabrooks at Harvard University in the 1920s, he was doing work in the hypnotherapy labs of the 1920s at Harvard. And by the 30s, he discovered a technique where you could take about 1 out of 5 people into this super deep state of hypnosis. And what he was then doing is able to reprogram a new personality. And he was going to create the super spy. He wrote a lot of papers. They subsequently became classified. Go to the Library of Congress and look up Estabrooks, and you'll find out a little storyline, by just looking at a sequence of publications. It'll just blow your mind. But by the 60s, this guy was talking about using LSD and hallucinogenics for changing behavior and talking about all this exotic stuff that later came out in the MK Ultra papers, in the Church Committee report in the United States Congress, that this is what the CIA had been doing since the 1950s, right? And we trace all that history. And all the footnotes that go with that history, tracing through the Central Intelligence Agency in controlling the human mind, as an example. And we reference them all through our books, because these themes keep reoccurring, manipulating behavior. Persinger in 1995 at Laurentian University, another citation, figured out that you could send a signal into the environment through electromagnetic waves that would just create a sense of dis-ease or agitation in the population. And then something as simple, and he put this in his paper, as just the normal news broadcast where you indict some ethnic group or some other group for all of your ills, terrorists or whatever. A certain amount of that angst would be focused there. And in the age of 50% plus one to decide major issues, that's a lot of influence. Well, this is way more sophisticated than that now. Since 95, for goodness sake. That's like the caveman days of technology when you think about how it's changed in this block of time.
Right.
We were running Apple IIe's, back then, barely introducing Macintosh, for goodness sake.
Yeah, and okay, so we just I want to keep on track here, because first we go from classical conditioning, and then we go to this sound conditioning we're talking about. But then you're jumping into, and you do this with HAARP, you talk about electromagnetic waves. So, So we understand that from what you told us before, that our wavelength our mood depends on our wavelength inside our brain. So how does electromagnetism alter our brain waves?
Here's how it works, and it's like very similar to like when you dial up a radio station, right? You go through all this bandwidth with the old style dial, right, until you get harmony, resonance between the transmitter and the receiver. So most of the noise in between is irrelevant. right? I mean, it doesn't matter until you get resonance. Same is true in the human body, whether it's on an atomic level, where there's resonance between that, where atoms can be resonated, and then their effects and their energy state changed, which then changes in the way they relate chemically and biologically to your system. You can do the same with a cell. The cell wavelength is proportioned to the size of the cell, so you can send a wavelength in that will couple with that cell and create an exchange of energy, perhaps heating, perhaps other things, depending on how you modulate, how you oscillate that. A body organ, the same way. In fact, the University of Utah did the radio frequency dosimetry handbook in the 1980s to look at radio frequency energy as an example's effect on each organ, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, and the lungs, to figure out how to stop a heart without touching anybody. This kind of weapons application by gaining the knowledge of sort of how the energy state can be manipulated from externally. What we know about the brain is what's now taught in every university that teaches advanced psychology, teaches about FFR, frequency following responses. It's what we were talking about a little while ago. What happens here and through the eyes, through the cranium, or through energy introduced to you is the brain will lock on to those signals that it recognizes, okay? Just like the radio station. When it sees a signal, it recognizes it. It locks on, begins to go with it. Okay, that's frequency following response. That's how all these things work. That's their fundamental. To change emotion based on frequency following response is easy to do. Doing things more complex, that's the nature of the research that has been going on again for many decades. The latest contracts I think that I looked at were 2013 vintage, University of California. One to measure the electromagnetic field surrounding the head and to interpret those signals. In other words, to read the mind. And the other was to recreate complex signals, send them into a third-party mind and see if you could transfer the thought. That's where this is. Now, I've worked with some of the best biophysicists on the planet. Alexander K. Varanin, the head of the biophysics lab for the USSR Academy of Science for the last 10 years. There was such a thing. And that's his specialty area, was biophysics and the paranormal in terms of explaining it through biophysics, how all that stuff works. This is where a lot of the science went, because what was discovered by our military in the course of their developing the technologies was that human beings had this sort of latent capability, sort of the other side of this, that if it were ever awakened, things that we used to refer to as extrasensory perceptions and these unusual characteristics, the military calls them anomalous human capabilities. And they write about them. I mean, we quote a lot of their literature about these things. And they're very curious about them, but they're also scared to death of the whole idea of it. I mean, imagine the model of electronic telepathy, reading a person's mind. Imagine that, reading another national leader's mind. But imagine not needing hardware to accomplish this, which is exactly what the CIA discovered.
Right.
And that scared them. So the quick element for them is, how do we turn this off? How do we stop this from happening? And it's the simplest thing of all, the easiest way of all. You just keep people in a constant state of agitation. Look around. That's the state of the world today.
Okay, so let's talk about the state of agitation. But you know what you were just talking about, Ingo Swann. You heard the story of him blowing up the computers. I think they used that in The Men Who Stare at Goats. But how he destroyed the computers at NATO or something. Okay. So Ingo Swann was a remote viewer and part of this. So that's a whole other thing we could talk about if you want to hang out for a couple more hours, but you probably don't. So first of all, this is kind of a long, drawn-out question. So we have some kind of electromagnetic manipulation. You talk about sound, okay? So let's ask this question first: who's doing it? And is this organized against us, and to what purpose?
Here's what I would say: the experimentation goes back, to not just our government, but every sophisticated government is engaged in this research. Chinese are, the Russians are, for sure, absolutely are.
But are they doing it to me right now? I mean, I have a computer in front of me, and
I couldn't answer that. You would have to look at each of those signals coming in, and then you would have to break down all of those modulations and submodulations carried on those.
But it's possible. It's possible.
It's absolutely possible. In fact, there's an article called "The Mind Has No Firewalls," published by the U.S. Army War College Quarterly called Perimeters from the late 1990s. Look up The Mind Has No Firewalls online, and it'll discuss exactly what we're talking about today. And this is 20 years old, what they had in the open literature, okay, 20 years ago. It's really about resolution is what's increasing, the ability to get more of a picture, and not just by looking at your individual brain, but looking at the information you freely give up every day, every time you turn on any electronic device.
Right.
Everything is given up in that. Every time you use a discount card, a charge card, any kind of electronic anything, all of that data is collected. Now, what does it give you? If you get 3,000 data points, which everybody that easy, that number of data points will effectively change and give the profile of someone who lived with you for 20 years to predict what you'll do, to say what you'll do. But those 3,000 data points will also predict what you will do better than you will. Better than you will. Now, this is really an important consideration because these machines, as they become more complex and more capable, the ability to hone in and message in, this is just the overt, obvious stuff. But then if you already come into it, think about when people come home from work and they go in front of the television set and their spouse is hollering, hey, dinner's ready. They don't even hear it because they're literally in a light trance. That's why you don't hear it. Your consciousness is elsewhere. If you put an EEG on your head, you would see it. You would see it as clearly as the light of day. And here's the thing, you're not watching the program. You're in a highly suggestive state because of the way the signal works. Now, is that by design or default? I don't know. But I know the state you're in is in that receptive state where you're sucking in the ads and the propaganda feed from what they call news in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And anyone who thinks it's news needs to go back and look at what news used to look like. This is not news. This is propaganda.
Okay, so that's the second part of my question then, because you're talking about us being in a state of agitation, which is being electromagnetically manipulated, and at the same time we have all this stuff we're being bombarded with on TV. I mean, we've got thousands of invasion of people coming across the border. The Chinese are doing this. The Europe is in flames, and the Russians are, and it just doesn't stop. And so it's like a double whammy. Is that on purpose?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is by design. I mean, these are the things that get your adrenaline cranked up. And then you think about the adrenaline swing and how many people are suffering from adrenal fatigue and how much of this news really matters. I mean, it always was happening. I mean, there were riots somewhere in the world before we had television. There were riots and protests stuff. We just didn't get the news for a year. Now we get it right now. So it floods into us. And, I don't watch television. All right, I don't watch television. I'm very well informed, but I don't watch television. And I say that with one caveat. When I travel, I'll turn it on just to do a temperature check and flip through the channels, And I'm always amazed at how much worse it continues to get after having turned it off 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. You can stay informed, but you don't have the agitation. That's for darn sure. And most of it doesn't matter in your daily life is the other piece. But it's not allowing it to take you, gaining back control of your consciousness and ripping it away from the television set and the data feeds and returning back to not going backwards in time, but at least returning back to the dignity of our humanity and how we interact with each other, which is without an electronic interface. When we can get together, we should be doing more of it, not less of it. And this technology drives us the opposite direction. And it makes us reliant on the technology for the data feed, which is always tailored to fit you and becoming increasingly so. So it's a feedback loop. And then when things like an election happen and you don't expect the outcome because you've been locked in your feedback loop, now you're in the little warm-up corner with your teddy bear because you're in shock. You got to be informed. That's one of the roots of a democratic republic. That's what this show's about, right? Talking about books, issues, things that people used to actually do. Read something.
Yeah. Well, and that goes that goes back into what you're saying. That people didn't see, like I kind of told my wife when I saw Trump was running, I said, that guy might win, and compared to the choice, and I could not understand how anybody would have chosen the alternative. I just don't understand how anybody would have considered that. But then we talk about, and you're talking about how they can manipulate us so they know exactly what we're going to do. So the less educated we are, the more easily we're
manipulated. Absolutely true.
And then it goes back into education.
And there's another feedback loop, right? Because here you are with and you can see it in the test scores, you can see it in how people think. It's dumbed it down, and it's created such a diverse curriculum, you can't even teach the core things, which are reading, writing, and arithmetic, and thinking. How to critically examine material, how to collect data and think about it and make decisions, how to debate, how to argue, how to use knowledge, right? Because now feeding people specific information beyond like sixth grade, the basic history, the basic data elements, then you can get anything from the world now. The whole world is open to you if you want to go dive into it in terms of knowledge. And so we need to restructure education to get people connected in ways that are different and get information more broadly debated. And what we see is the opposite. We see channels of communication being routed, silenced, voices being silenced in the media today. These are all dangerous signs of the 21st century. It's about information, about being informed. Why reading books is important, because as you're reading, you're thinking actively. You're outlining, you're marking them up, depending on how you do your books. But this is an active thinking process. It's not just a being fed process. This is why reading is important, why books are important, why engaging writing process is even important, as you connect sort of the two sides of the brain, the analytical, the creative, and how the body works. But when you think about consciousness, the root, things that were discovered in all of those areas of science dealing with the mind, this is what is going to determine whether we're free or slaves. It begins in our minds, right? I mean, this is why freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, this is the domain of the mind. Just our founding fathers 250 years ago didn't predict these kinds of technologies. How could they? They wasn't even in the realm of science fiction, wasn't even evolved enough to write about this stuff. It's so far out.
Yeah.
Okay, but the principles that guided us then can guide us today in the 21st century, whether we live in the United States or somewhere else in the world, because these are things that deal with the basic essence of who we are. They cross over all the religious traditions. They cross over all of these things to get to the heart of what we are. Should government or the private sector at this time in our history be able to dive into our mental function and tamper with our awareness, our consciousness, and our thought process? I don't think so. Not in this way, not in this time. And that's why we wrote Controlling the Human Mind to begin with. It's a warning. All of our books have been that. But a warning with solutions attached, not just the last thing I want to do is create fear. I want to empower people so we can begin to do something different.
Right. And that's what I want to, we're kind of running toward the end of this, unless you want to stick around for another hour, but you probably don't. But I just want to make sure that people know your website is earthpulse.com, correct?
Correct.
And go on there because there's a number of things on there, a number of the articles that Nick used in his books, some nice resource information. Other books are Earth Rising 1 and 2. He wrote that with Gene Manning. You wrote, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, you wrote with
Gene Manning.
Then
okay. The other two, the Earth Rising series, were with my research assistant. And he's passed away, Jim Roderick. And another hero, James did some great stuff with me over about a 5-year period, actually before that.
Yeah.
And then the last book, Controlling the Human Mind, which has been most of the topic of today. We touch on all of them a little bit, and they all overlap. But it really boils down to being informed, to taking information. People who get the book, when you're done with it, send it to policymakers. That can make a difference.
Right.
Simple things like this make a difference because people are. It's not about people being stupid. It's about people not having full information. That's all. We all can read. We all can get there. We can get there together.
But you've seen enough of this we're talking about, as we look around, obviously this is not being used for positive purposes, but can't they zap us with, how to build an engine, or can't they use this technology for something positive to make us better people? I think you touch on that.
I do, but then it needs to be self-directed and controlled. And here's the problem. Some of the things they're anticipating is like literally downloading data files into your brain directly. So once they gain a good, big enough understanding of how that actually works, they'll be able to do it. Then who controls the curriculum? Okay, this bypasses the conscious mind, that part of the mind that filters out right, wrong, good, evil, according to our belief systems. Then that goes straight into that part of the mind that, is deep. If it conflicts with your conscious ideas, that's the root of most forms of psychosis, quite frankly. It's conflicts within the conscious and subconscious mind. So what goes in, you want to control. And some of the new technologies, like the light and sound devices that are on our website, you can make your own audio tapes of your own suggestions, right? So it's your own voice, you trust your voice, you trust what you're saying. But then you can set the light and sound signals so that you get into that highly suggestive state and program yourself. That's the right kind of programming. Program yourself and recognize these technologies. There are some things we just should not do, like blinding lasers and chemical weapons. No one belongs in your brain but you, and permission should not be permitted to be granted. In other words, it's not like a waiver where you get to give it up. Certain things you should not be allowed to give up, and no one should be allowed to ask. And these are the domains of consciousness and our personal freedom, the root of it, who we are.
Okay, and that goes into there's in Jurassic Park where the guy says nobody ever asked the question, or not can we do it, but should we do it? And that's what we see today, is that you see all of these politicians and people come from Google and say, oh, we can spy on all these people and we can do all these things that you're talking about, and they say, oh, great. What is wrong with people's minds? And I think it really boils down to how much money they can make, because it's a new project, it's a new technology, it's more funding, or it's something that they can sell more easily. And today, when so much money is at stake, like if you put out a movie or a product, if you can manipulate people's minds to buy it by spending a few extra bucks, then why would you want Madison Avenue?
Or this when they do use Madison Avenue, because for instance, like gaming now today, they use three-dimensional MRIs. We write about this, and we wrote about 20 years ago. They look at the brain as you're playing the game, and then what they're trying to do is create light and sound signals that will trigger the same areas of the brain associated with addictive behavior and orgasm, because you're coming back to that game if those same neurons are firing, and they figured it out. Same with good advertising in quotes, that works, is if they put you in the right state. Why do you think they spend millions of dollars for a 30 or 60 second spot? Because the brain can be entrained in 10 to 15 seconds and the data needs to flow in. Mm-hmm. That's why, and it works, it's not regulated. Because it works, for goodness sake. That's why billions and billions and trillions now are being made in the information age by those who have the information and can sell the data and then control the feeds. This is what it is about in this century. We've been warning about it for 25 years. The reality is here today. Even with HAARP, the big objection of the military was, it takes antennas kilometers by kilometers in size. We don't have that. But you know what? In the last 6 months, there's been a press report from China. They do. By kilometers, they do. We said so 25 years ago. We've been right since. Every book, everything we've written, we've never retracted any of our predictions because they're based on hard data. And I stand by them today. Take a look. The story, the proof is in the pudding, and time has told the tale. And that's the difference. We need a press that's invigorated, particularly in the areas of technology. This is what determines whether we're going to be free or slaves in the 21st century, and each of us have to have enough knowledge to enter that debate with the confidence and the force of our personalities to change the way it's going. In the Congress, 535 congressional leaders, and a half a dozen of them have engineering or or science background of any consequence. And they're deciding the biggest, most important issues of the century, and they don't even have the knowledge. They go into closed committee hearings. This is how it works. Closed committee hearings, no staff, no notes, no outside experts. They have to take what they're told. They don't have the foundational knowledge to ask the right questions. And when those congressional leaders charged with oversight leave, they can't talk to anybody. That is not oversight, ladies and gentlemen. That is a travesty in the 21st century. That is what has changed this country fundamentally and stripped us of our dignity as participating people within a democratic republic. And that is what people are angry about. That's why Donald Trump got elected, because people are angry at the inauthenticity of it and being directed by a technocracy that is out of control. And we all feel it. We all know it. And that's why people who aren't playing the game get elected. We need other people to get in the game that aren't playing by the Republican Party rules. Because remember, he was an outsider there too.
Yeah.
16 people, their best of the best, couldn't beat this foul-mouthed guy. Now why? People knew what they got. No surprises in Donald Trump. And you know what's really amazing is he's actually done what he said. More so than any president in our history. And the mainstream media's ignored it. Lowest unemployment, biggest job growth, NAFTA renegotiated with Canada and Mexico, NATO paying more of their bill. I mean, on and on and on.
Yeah, and you left out one thing. You left out the perpetual agitated state. That they got that too. So, and you know that's fairly obvious. That's Donald Trump was their biggest success because they did create the perpetual agitated state that probably won't end after he's long gone. So
no, but they didn't expect him to win. You see, because he has really gone counter to a lot of the big guys. Think about the guys who are attacking the most: YouTube, Google, Facebook. These guys. Why? Because most of their income was earned out of the USA, and it wasn't taxed at all. What they all did is set up like tax havens, like in Ireland, where they get taxed 5%. They put their intellectual property there, and then they charge them an amount equal to their profit margin here for all that use. And so they didn't make any money here. They made money there. So they paid nothing. Yeah. Well, if you're an American company living in America and you got the Donald Trump tax cut, it helps you. It saves money. You're spending that money here. For these guys, it hurt them. Yeah. They're hurting him. Yeah. It didn't work for them. It didn't work for the pharmaceutical industry. It didn't work for the big multinationals. Yeah. It grabbed them by the throat and made them taxable, just like you and me on our worldwide income.
Yeah.
Hooray. Long overdue. Not ever done by the Democrats. Took Republicans to figure that one out.
Yeah, okay. So then it just kind of goes right into everything that you're talking about. We are definitely being manipulated. So
yeah, and it's a war. I think it really is. It's an information war happening over our minds, over our beliefs, and over influencing the general public. And the only way to counter this is to get informed, deliberately get informed, read material, read what your opposition's doing wherever you sit on these issues, understand your opposition more clearly, and then engage in a debate. Yeah. Not a confrontation.
Well, you know, I talk to, I mean, my friends are very left, very right, and everybody's on about the same thing. So I don't understand how there is a left and a right because everybody's angry. It's just different things that they talk about. Nick, before I let you go, it's a new thing, and I'd like to know what your take on it is. But before I talk about 5G, and controlling the human mind, in your books, are you going to give people solutions? I mean, I'm sure you're not going to tell people to go out and put this hat on made of tinfoil to keep the waves out. But do you give people advice into how to survive in this kind of environment?
Well, first of all, that's what everybody defaults to. But the answer to that is yes and no. Would you default to that idea of surviving and kind of getting through it is a different mindset, and it already means you lost because you're in fear. I mean, so you're in some sense of anxiety at some level. So that's the enemy, all right? Fear is the enemy, anxiety is the enemy. We really have to start to look internally. What do we need to change about ourselves to become a little more perhaps forgiven. And a lot of things we see in terms of violent acts right now are being done in the name of religion, of all different persuasions, And what I would say about that is most of these religious organizations believe that we're created in the image and likeness of God, that we're somehow divine at some level. I think we should start treating each other divinely, perhaps. That changes the nature of the dialogue, when you look at each other in that way. And coming at it differently. This should be about, if somebody's opposing me, for instance, what do? I listen. Because I want to know what took them there. They didn't just go, I just believe this out of nowhere. Everybody gets there from a set of ideas, logic, information. I want to know what it is that took a person there, because I'm really interested in knowing that. Once I know that, I'll know two things, or maybe more, but I'll know at least two things. What I didn't know, because he just filled in my blanks, or what he doesn't know because he didn't identify what I can now give him in new information. Now you're in a dialogue, okay? Sharing information. But ultimately, the debate ought to be over the solution. So you should always put forward a solution, even if it's not going to be adopted. Fight over that, and we'll get one. If we just want to rehash the problems, we're never going to get anywhere. And that's what's going on in the country right now. This is what the media is doing. You want to talk about manipulation? This is what the manipulation of both parties is about. Keep us fighting over issues that really don't matter when the fundamental things are being stripped from us right under our noses. The issues that are, the big issues, the big hot button issues, chances are they're going to be decided by the Supreme Court. We're not even going to vote on that. The things that matter to us every day, we can engage in right now. And that's the challenge of the 21st century. Finding the divinity in each other again, recognizing consciousness begins inside of ourselves, and we're connected to everyone in a fundamental way. And even the physics teaches us this now. Get back to remembering what we are, the thing that scared the hell out of government when they figured out what we could do. Then we change the world, and then we do it in the way that our founding fathers did, when they recognized the diversity of religion, the need for assembly, and the need for a press, not to keep us manipulated, but to keep us informed, so these kinds of discussions could happen 250 years later and never be suppressed. That's the challenge of the century.
All right. Well, that's probably about the best place to end this interview, Nick. Those are really wise words. And do you have any political aspirations?
I had at one point in my life, but really no. And I'll tell you why. Is today when I look at the way political leadership are treated, I have no interest in that mud wrestling match. I just don't. It's not respectful. It's not dignified, and it certainly doesn't represent the character of American people that I believe is still out there. When that character changes, maybe, but no, I'm not interested in this the way it's shaped right now. I think I'm better doing what I do now, which is take the issues I truly am passionate about and care about. And a big part of that is just getting people to talk together. I think there's a higher purpose in that, at least for this life, as I see it projected in the next few years.
Okay, and are you doing any more lecturing?
I do a little bit. I do a lot of radio work still, from Alaska and around the world. I do a couple lectures a year when I'm invited and the forums seem interesting. But I'm pretty selective in that anymore because I really want to make sure I'm reaching people with the underlying message, which is this one we're sort of ending with, which is, even controlling the human mind, starts with our own, and that's where it all begins. And I'm optimistic. I'm built that way. I see all the disaster in the world as the opportunity, because in the midst of all these tragedies is where fundamentally that's where we change as individuals and collectively. And we are in the midst of it. We are in the middle of it. And I look forward to it. And I think it awakens people as we suffer through it together, if you will. We learn a lot about ourselves and each other. And in that, we become more forgiving of ourselves and each other. And in that begins a dialogue that I think is a healthier one to have, and one that will get our government back to us and return to us. I mean, think about the U.S. government, things that we've read about over the last 20 years. Torture, kidnapping, extortion, going through garbage and blackmailing people. This is our government. They scream at the Russians for getting involved in the DNC server. Well, we engage in regime change, for God's sake. Well, we go in and just strip a country of its leadership by bombs or otherwise. These are felonies. most of this, torture and all this stuff, kidnapping. If you did it, and bribery too, blatant bribery all over the world, our government does. They do it in our name. Government for the people, by the people, and of the people. I don't know that many felons. I just don't. And to have a government operating feloniously, we got to reel it in and make it responsible to be the kind of government we can be proud of again. That's not meddling in everybody else's affairs, which is what we do. And then condemn them that we oppose for doing exactly the same thing. We got to change. We change here first, individually first. Mind control is about that.
Yeah, well, there's myself included, there's a lot of people who agree with you and are out there, actually doing stuff to try to bring about a positive change. So it's really nice to hear your refreshing message. And we're all at a loss because you didn't stay in politics or get into the Senate or whatever. But I guess that's Alaska politics and a whole other story.
Yeah.
But anyway, Nick, it's been so great having you on the podcast. It's a real honor. You're such a great public servant, and you've done so much, and to bring light on these issues that basically a lot of people wouldn't even know about if it weren't for you. So we all owe you a great debt of gratitude. And I just have to say this again, Nick's books are Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Earth Rising 1 and 2, Controlling the Human Mind. Those books are available Amazon, iTunes. I'm not sure if they're available on your website. I've got them on my website, Books in Hindsight, and I've got them on Books in Hindsight and links on hindsight.com.
Yep.
So, get Nick's books. They are fantastic. They're real eye openers, and I wish I could keep you around for another hour or two, but anyway, maybe you can come back and do the podcast again.
We'll do it another time. We'll do it another time for sure. And I appreciate the time, and my best to your listening audience. And thank you for supporting our work and getting the message out. We appreciate it.
All right, Nick. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. So to all you people out there that are listening to this podcast, this has been Dr. Nick Begich from Alaska. And if you don't do anything else this week, especially you kids, keep on reading.
This has been Books in Hindsight with your host, Matthew Hines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to thehindsight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Hines and other great authors.